Well, hello and welcome back into the Map Room. But today we're not doing one of our normal podcast episodes. We're going back to what we described as the Map Room briefings, essentially bite-sized briefings to help you consider areas that may be beneficial to help you run your agency that little bit better. And today we're going to talk about budgeting. So I'm delighted to welcome into the Map Room my colleague Sina, who's one of our client accountants and will hopefully help us get us through this subject today. Hi, Sina. How are you?
Hi, Stuart. Great to be on. Thank you. Good to speak to you.
Okay. I always try and put everything we do into a little bit of context. I lost my first business. I was a rather young salesman who thought I knew better, and I started a business and thought that budgets and business plans were a waste of time. And I thought if you sell enough and you have enough orders, you will succeed. I classically, now I know, overtraded in that business. And whilst we were great at getting orders, we were not great at managing our cash flow and understanding the implications of costs into our business. So I'm the first to say I am a total convert to budgets, and I'm now very biased and precious about the value of them to your business. But putting that aside, my first question, Sina, is, in your view, what is a budget?
For me, a budget is essentially a plan that you put together, or at least this is how I discuss it with my clients anyway, a plan that you put together for the year ahead. You use it as a target setting exercise, as a cost management exercise. Just essentially it's an opportunity to review all the incomings and outgoings through the business, and for you to have a full view and essentially just manage both the incomings and the outgoings and plan ahead for the year ahead. That's the way I describe it.
Okay. And for you then, why do they matter?
There's a variety of reasons. I think the reason will depend on what type of business and the size of business that you have. I've obviously discussed this with clients that are smaller agencies and bigger agencies, and the reason behind those are slightly different. So for the smaller agencies, again, is making sure that they're not really overspending on anything that they kind of, for example, with software and subscriptions is one where a lot of our clients a lot of the costs go into, just to review all the subscriptions, and it will be small adjustments that are made. But for the bigger agencies is to essentially look at the overview, and again, the small amounts of course do matter, but it's more the margins, making sure that you're setting the right targets from a gross profit margin, operating profit margin, and so on.
So what you're saying to me in essence is this is something that looks at the year ahead. So I'm assuming therefore is the ideal time to do this just before your previous year ends or as your new year starts. What's the ideal timing to do this?
So what I tend to do is, I have quarterly conversations with all my clients in the final quarter of the year. If we do a budget in service, actually, regardless of whether we do a budget in service or not, I always tell them that now is the time to think about the next 12 months, because it's really difficult to just build a budget in the last month, because not only are you really looking into the details of what the budget is made up of, but you also have to start kind of forecasting into what kind of revenue you're looking at, what changes could potentially come up in the business in the next 12 months. So it's not something that can be done in 1 or 2 days or even a week or two, especially for a business owner that, again, as you know from experience, it's you're constantly kind of spinning multiple plates at the same time. So I always think the final quarter is the best time to start thinking about those things, because again, it's giving you an opportunity to review the year that you're in and start to think ahead for the following 12 months.
Okay, interesting. So what you're saying is this, although it could be for lots of clients, it's not start-stop project. It's probably look at it in bite-sized chunks over a period of time as you're coming to the end of the year. And you've said to me there, so it's an annual plan that looks at your income coming in, your revenue and your expenses. And you've mentioned something there which is prevalent in the sector we represent, agencies, something such as software subscriptions. But give people, for those who maybe don't have a budget at the minute, what kind of elements do they need to understand, or would you be challenging them on to help them build a budget?
I think if we're really talking in simple terms, I think the budget needs to be broken down on a monthly basis, first and foremost. You to break down the costs on a month-to-month basis and break down the budget as well. And then you would have different categories or different departments in the business that you would spend money on. So you would have employment costs, you would have software and subscriptions, advertising and marketing. And each of those categories will be made up of a variety of suppliers or the different types of costs that go in there. I think firstly, you need to get the format right. So you need to write down all your outgoings and start to categorize in each. And then that way you can essentially see what the monthly outgoing is, which would then feed into a master profit and loss, as I call it, or a summary page, which would then have the revenue. For example, the month of August, you have the revenue, cost of sale, and then you would have employment costs, advertising, marketing, and so on and so forth. But I think if you've never done a budget before, that's the first step, to essentially look at all your costs, write them down, and start to categorize in it, just to make it a little bit more, give it a bit more framework to make it easier for you to kind of think about those elements.
Okay, let's spend a minute on, say, categories, because what lots of small business owners do is see it as one pot, don't they? They'll see this money's coming in. They often make the mistake that it's their money. It's not. The company is always a legal entity in its own right. And then sometimes they might siphon, when I say siphon bits off, I mean ready for payroll or whatever, but they tend not to look at everything. So what you're saying there is, so there is obviously the sales, the income you're going to make back from whatever product it is you're selling. You mentioned their cost of sales. So that is what would go into cost of sales. Are these indirect costs or are they direct costs for people?
So they would be solely direct cost. All the indirect costs would be essentially the operating costs, which would be included below the gross profit line. Anything that relates directly to you generating revenue in the business, that would be included. That would be categorized as a direct cost and included in cost of sales.
Okay. And then what you're saying then is what I would maybe call the operating costs are broken down. It could be dependent on what your staff member does. They could be above that line or below that line. So you've got employment costs, premises costs, rent, rates, utilities included. We've mentioned software and subscriptions. What other things go in there that maybe surprise people when you sit and do a budget, that they would go, oh, well, I don't know where to find that information? Or
just, you mean in terms of the operating cost, or just in terms of both cost of sale and operating?
In the operating cost. So obviously part of our job is, one of the things that attracted me to MAP when I was first a client, and then I think adds value, is we use a sort of 7 to 8 line P&L. So rather than the extended P&L as everything, we will truncate it to a few key aspects. And so in employment costs, there could be, let's just say, gym memberships, health insurance, etc. I'm just wondering whether there are ever areas when you say to somebody, help me understand what you spent last year on X, they think, oh, I don't know where to look for that. Are there any surprising areas for people?
For me, and I know we've discussed it already, but software and subscriptions is a big one, because everyone knows they're spending money on software and subscriptions. But when you actually tell them, like, for example, this particular cost, I can see it's been going out every month, but is that needed in the business? Is everyone using it? And they're not quite sure as to whether it is or not. And it's those kind of conversations with them, which then I think leads the business owner to think, actually, this is probably a conversation I need to have with the team to determine whether or not we need this particular software, for example. And the other one is probably staff training, actually, talking of employment, because everyone has some type of staff training throughout the year, but they don't usually think about it to that extent to say, right, how much are we going to spend? How much did we spend last year? So that's one where I've brought it up a couple of occasions, and on both occasions I've said, right, we need to go and actually have a look at this and come back to you with an answer. And they tend to be larger amounts as well, but I think it goes a bit under the radar.
I'd agree with that. And the one that I also see very often is recruitment. People assume that this is what I spent on my team last year, whether there is or isn't any pay awards to be made. I'll be spending this amount this year. And then we say, well, what about retention of staff? What about recruitment? Because I think traditionally recruitment costs come as a bit of a blow to people when they're looking to replace a leaver.
No, that's absolutely right. And again, we still see that being the case now. So it's difficult to gauge exactly how much kind of recruitment costs you would have in the next year or so. But I always recommend leaving a provision in there of some kind, even if, again, you're not going to know who's going to leave in the next 12 months. But it's good to have something in the budget as a worst case scenario.
And let's just talk about sort of the process for building a budget, because one of the reasons I was against it back in the day was ignorance. That was one thing. But also they're sort of looking forward and looking in the crystal ball to say, well, what will our sales be in August next year, maybe even a year from now, or what people will have in the business is always hard. Is it as simple as saying, look, let's look at what we did last year? So let's start with What were our employment costs last year? What was maybe our office rent or our travel if it's remote? What was our spend on utilities? Do you start there or do you start with a blank sheet?
So when we're building a budget, bearing in mind, at least in my client base, the clients vary between clients that are very heavy on retainers versus clients that are very heavy on project work. Obviously, the project work one is a really difficult one to gauge exactly, what's going to happen, not just in the next 12 months, but particularly quarter 3 and 4 in the following year. So what I always recommend is let's build the basis to the budget, which is the operating costs, the costs that we know will be going out regardless. And then we can look at the revenue. Now, I always ask them to plug in the revenue that they know will happen at least in quarter 1 and quarter 2. And then for the rest of it, we'll do a target setting exercise and we'll say, right, yes, this is how we did last year and the year before. But because of the type of work that, for example, you might be doing, we may not be able to rely on the numbers from the last 2 years. It's such an unknown. So we'll say, right, rather than try to forecast, we'll hit a target. We'll say, right, this is the operating profit margin we're trying to achieve, which translates into an X amount from a monetary value, and then work backwards to say, right, that means that in quarter 2 and quarter 3, we need to bring in X amount of revenue to hit those targets. Anything above that will naturally be a bonus.
Okay, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because I presume there are two ways of doing this. There's classically top down. So what do we think we're going to sell? And therefore, what cost do we need to support that level of revenue? And there's the bottom up, which is, look, we know we've got these costs, and therefore what do we need to sell to minimum meet these costs and then make a margin?
I think it does depend on, like I said, if you're a retainer heavy type of business and it's easier to forecast the next 12 months in terms of revenue, then absolutely, as you said, it's easier to do the revenue part. And then you work backwards to say, right, do we need to expand the team, for example? How does the operating costs look? But then from the flip side of that, again, if your project, I think the bottom up would probably work better, at least as a conversation starter.
Yeah. I mean, in the agencies that I've been involved with, it was predominantly project based. And so, yes, I was always a fan of bottom up to be able to understand this is the revenue we need. And I feel it's easier then, although it's not necessarily easy to achieve, but it's easy to set the targets to say, this is what we know. And then what's the known unknown? What's the gap? So this is our confirmed, this is our order book, whatever phrase people like, and this is what we need to do. I think it's a lot easier at the start of the year to say, look, guys, we need to identify £360,000 of projects rather than it is to going into the quarter to say we now need to find this. The more time you can give visibility, I think the more chance you've got of getting there. So we've done an exercise and we've got essentially, I'm going to say a piece of paper because I'm old fashioned. I know it'll be a Google sheet these days. So we've got a Google sheet that says, here is our best guesstimate. That's all it can be. None of us are, are experts looking at the crystal ball. And this is what I think our sales are going to be. Project or retainer? Retainer, yes, is probably known. And these are our costs. What do we do with it then? Does it just get frozen and kept? Or is there a review process? Or should there be a review process?
There should most certainly be a review process. So what I tend to do is, and I think we do it across the board at Mac with all our clients, is do a 6+6 budget. So what that means is then midway through the year, you review the performance of the business in the first half of the year to compare it against budget, and then you essentially play around with the budget for the second half and then make any changes if we need to re-budget essentially for the second half of the year. Now, that doesn't mean we don't look at the budget at all in the first half or the second half. For clients that, again, do have management accounts, or whether they do or they don't internally, I always encourage them to do a budget comparison or budget variance against the actual performance of the business, because it gives you an opportunity to really look at where the shortfalls are, especially if it's a budget that you've set, you've gone through all the costs. There shouldn't really be that much of a difference, especially from a cost perspective. There shouldn't really be that much of a difference in the first quarter or the second quarter compared to what you've put. That gives the business owner opportunity to really scrutinize the outgoings. And I think, again, without that budget, without that analysis being there, you could kind of fall into a habit of not really paying attention to what's leaving the business, what's going out of the business. And then that's when you start having issues further down the line, not just in terms of profitability, but in terms of cash flow as well. So just to summarize, I think a review midway through the year is more certainly required. But I still think, again, a budget review, budget analysis on a monthly or quarterly basis would be good from a visibility perspective as well.
Okay, so just so again, for clarity for anyone who's not used to the sort of phraseology we use, when we say variance analysis, we're saying says, and they say whether this is monthly, quarterly, or the half year, we said we were going to do £10 of sales and spend £5, but our report tells us we've only done 8, or we've done 12, and we've spent 4, or we've spent 6. So it just tells you where you are. And what you're then saying is, what you like to do is get your teams in the sheds at half time and work out whether we are 1-0 down or 1-0 up, and what we need to do in the second half to get where we need to get to.
Great analogy.
What sort of common either misconceptions or errors do you see in those clients that either don't maybe recognize the value of the budget and therefore don't have one, or those who may do it just as a box ticking exercise, whichever way round? What do you think the common misconceptions are about the role of the budget, and where do you see common mistakes made?
So the common errors, there's actually 2 that come to mind. I always think from a revenue perspective, we always tend to be more optimistic than being a realist.
Most entrepreneurs are, Sina, most entrepreneurs are.
Absolutely. So I always try and challenge it, just to be devil's advocate, to say, I love that number, but what's the science behind it? And even if they are adamant that can happen, I would still insist on creating a worst case and best case scenario and say, right, is what you're giving me the best case scenario or the worst case? If it's bang in the middle, then let's, just for argument's sake, say what the best case would be and what the worst case would be. And then I'll try and kind of focus on the worst case to say, right, if the worst case was to happen, are we still looking at making a profit at the end of the year? What are we looking at from a margin perspective? And then just lead the conversation. From a cost perspective, I see this, especially with businesses that already have an internal budget. When they tell me they have an internal budget, I always tell them, do you want to send it over just for me to review? You don't necessarily have to, obviously, provide the service. It's good to have something to work with. And what I tend to see is that there are a lot of round numbers. There's a lot of assumptions in the figures. And one that I see a lot is insurance. Insurance is a common, and I'm just going to use that as an example. So insurance, every business will have maybe 2 or 3 different types of insurance, but there would just be one line that says insurance and you might have an amount per month. That's great, but what is the breakdown of that? What is that made up of? How many different providers have you got? What's the monthly cost? And again, especially with insurance, because it tends to be an annual policy, there is always an increase across the year. So again, where is that increase reflected on the budget? And I use that as an example just to say, right, it's great that you're looking at these numbers. It's great that you have something in there, but we need to break it down into slightly more of a detailed perspective. And as long as they can apply that to the rest of the budget, then that, they've already given themselves a much more clearer view of from a cost perspective than they had last year. Just from a misconception perspective, one that I've heard a couple of times is that we're already on top of all the costs. We already know exactly what's leaving the business. It's okay. And even in the best case scenario, once you actually sit down, there always ends up being 1 or 2 items that they may have not considered or not thought about. So those are the things that come to mind.
I think having my own experience of 2 agencies and actually discussing in a recent podcast episode is the one that we do see lots, isn't it, is software and subscriptions or licenses, where I think we are very adept in this industry of firing up an application or a tool because it was needed for a particular project. That's what I did, and wonder why you're still spending on Figma or something else so many years later. 2 clear messages I've heard seen. One is, and in terms of the reason you should do it and the potential errors, is the detail matters. If you're going to make massive assumptions, you're not giving yourself the best tool that you can use. So be accurate in what's going in. And I suppose the other one is as you said, the role of a review. I have been there and I've spoken personally with many clients for whom they lose confidence in the budget because after a couple of months, the reality is moving away from the plan. So they sort of almost dismiss it. And sometimes it's easier to put it back in the drawer than it is to sit and have those conversations to say, okay, well, we said this, but now we need to look at that. So help people out. Again, I suppose, again, it's not just a valuer review. It's what kind of questions does somebody need to be asking of themselves and of their budget to have had that piece of work be valuable 6 months down the line.
I think firstly, the budget needs to be used also as a scenario planning tool as well. As I'm sure you can attest to this as well. As a business owner, no 2 days are the same, right? You don't know what tomorrow will bring. So it's more using the budget from a financial perspective to say, yeah, if we were to bring in another team member, or if someone was to suddenly leave, what would that mean just in terms of, from a financial perspective to replace them? Again, there's recruitment costs and so on. And the purpose of that is to give you control. Right. It's for you to have an overview of everything, to be in control, to never be in a position where you would make a panic decision, whether that's someone leaving or a big client leaving and so on and so forth.
I absolutely hear what you're saying there, Sina, and probably not for today, for another day. That's why I was always a fan of the concept of scenario planning. Was I would have a budget, and then I would have a copy of it. Started as a copy of the budget, latterly moved on to what we now would refer to as a live finance forecast that says, okay, that's what I said I was going to do. And then after every month, I would go, right, I said I was going to do £10 this month. I did 8. I put the 8 in the actuals, and I look at what else. And as you say, what happens if I bring that person in? Can I afford to bring that person in earlier? So I was a massive fan of using the live finance forecast as a really solid management tool, but that's probably a conversation for the day. We're getting close to time. We always like to keep these things for no more than 30 minutes as briefings. So I suppose maybe the last question, Sina, is if somebody's listening to this now and they're either questioning budgets, so they've looked at it before and maybe had one in the past or never had one and don't know whether it's right for their business, what would be one compelling reason for somebody to reach out to you and say, can you help me understand what a budget would mean for my business?
No one is running a business for the sake of running it, right? Everyone's doing it for a purpose. There is an end goal, right? You're either looking to sell the business or you're running a lifestyle business. So there's always something that you're working towards. Whatever that reason is the reason to have a budget. Because if you're trying to, and I know obviously we've done a lot of work on exiting the business and then the options around that. Budget is the basis for you to be able to do that. It starts from a 12-month budget, it turns into a 5-year budget, and it's the basis for you to achieving those goals. Similarly, if you're in a lifestyle business, you're looking at something as simple as, I want to extract money from the business to be able to renovate my house, right? That in itself is a reason to have a budget, because that allows you to set a target of operating profit, which then you can extract from the business as a director shareholder. I was just giving you those two as the two extreme examples from someone who might be running a director-only business as opposed to running a big agency. Any other reason fitting within those two extremes would still qualify as a legitimate reason to have a budget.
Interesting. Thank you, Sina. I suppose my closing point is it's just always a barometer, isn't it? It helps you set something out. And if you use it properly, don't just have one and stick it in a drawer. Use it, review it, use it for scenario planning to allow you to look at the what ifs. What if we did this now? What if the sales went up, went down, went sideways, etc.? Okay. Well, obviously, if someone is keen to understand what a budget looks like, Sina, how do they find you?
So yes, absolutely. Feel free to reach out to me on my email address at sina@wearemap.co.uk. Obviously, there's the map website as well, wearemap.co.uk, for any further information. And yeah, thank you for having me on, Stuart.
Wonderful. I do appreciate your time, Sina, and hopefully we will be able to help some more people soon with their budgets. Thanks. Bye for now.